So we're going to go to the New Testament, and we're going to read some words of Jesus. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34 is where I'd like to invite us to start our study here tonight. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34. Now, Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34, of course, we're more than a couple of weeks into the public ministry of Jesus. He's already made a name for himself in a very substantial way. And there's a number of people that have already committed to him. He has his 12 apostles. He has a few dozen disciples that are traveling with him. And the crowds that he's attracting now are very substantial. And so there's a lot of people that are making decisions one way or the other for Christ. And as that's taking place, Jesus, as he's kind of observing the people and such, he wants to make sure that as people are making that decision, that they understand what they're getting into. And so when we come to this, in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34, the next few verses that we're about to read, he kind of gets fairly frank and open, but it's good for us to study and read it. In verse 34, it says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." Okay? Now that's a whole other sermon and study. I've got to be careful not getting sidetracked on the Prince of Peace, saying that he didn't bring peace. Verse 35, it says, "For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves his father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me." And so we have some very kind of, what would you call it, bottom line words that Jesus here is sharing with us. And is it here? So first of all, we want to make sure we don't pull away from it what Jesus didn't intend to say. Is Jesus saying that we shouldn't love our son or our daughter? No, of course not. But he says if we love our family members more than Jesus, then we have a problem. And so Jesus here is saying that when it comes to prioritizing, when it comes to who's the highest authority and the most important person in your life, it's important to make sure that Jesus is the most important person in your life. Now, when we do that, as many of us in this room have probably experienced, especially if you weren't raised in a Christian church, if you weren't raised in a Christian family or a Seventh-day Adventist family and such, and you make that decision for Christ, and you step out, like these first disciples were, and such, pretty well it's universal experience is that there's immediate tensions that take place between yourself and different family members. And that's what I experienced. Anybody else experience that here? Yeah, you have a few hands that are going up, okay. And again, so it depends, of course, on where your family's at when you make that decision. And so Jesus here, of course, is talking about when you have family members that are not on the same page as you, that don't want to step out all the way, that can propose and bring some immediate challenges, some strains. Why? Because you're leaving the status quo of the world. You're deciding to follow God. And so Jesus wants to be upfront with that. Well, why am I introducing that particular counsel that Jesus gives to us? Why? Because I believe it's directly related to the figure that we started to study last week, which is the figure of Abraham. Okay, good. All right. So somebody's helping us to be able to jog our memories a little bit when we come to Genesis chapter 12. Last part of Genesis chapter 11, of course, was the first introduction to the figure of Abraham. And now we are in Genesis chapter 12. And as we come to this same man, the same individual, this great father of the faith, the father of the Jewish nation, of Israel, and so on, we find here that Abraham was called not only to go to the land of Canaan, but he was also called to leave his country and to leave his family as well. That's right. In fact, let's read that for ourselves. Let's go to Genesis 12, verses 1, 2, and 3, and let's read that together. It says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, And later on, it'll explain why his name became Abraham eventually, the same person, same figure of history. It says, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And so here we have God giving this great covenant. Now, this is no small conversation and covenant that we're reading here, is it? This is the foundation that God is making here, that is laying, I should say, is laying the foundation for the most important nation that has ever existed in history, which is the nation of Israel. And it's a huge part of God's plan of salvation, isn't it? And so this is a huge conversation. Yes.
And when God said to Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed because of you, how does that jive with this thing that Jesus said about the families, that some of your foes are going to come from within your own family?
Okay, so here we have Walt, and he's thinking right away, and it's a very good question. He's asking all of us here that he's saying if Jesus just told us that there would be strains within the family once you step out for Jesus, how is it that through Abraham all families in the world will be blessed? And so this is a prime example. Well, first of all, the families here, I would suggest, is not so much immediate families where you have the Brummunds or the Bachelors and so on, but rather you have the families of Earth's lineages. And so you have the descendants of Shem, the descendants of Japheth, the descendants of Ham, and so on and so forth. And so you have all the families of the earth that will be blessed. And so it's a general sweeping statement, and we're going to get to that a little bit later, but we might as well cover it now that we're there a little bit, is that ultimately, of course, how did God bless all of the world? Because it's pointing to all the families, all the nations, the races, the cultures, nationalities, every tribe, tongue, and people in the whole world. What's the greatest blessing that came through Abraham eventually and through the nation of Israel? Was Jesus Christ, right? And so the Messiah is being promised here. And so at the very heart of the covenant, because this is a calling for Abraham, but it's also a covenant. The calling is leave your family, leave your country, go to a country that you've never seen before, a land that you don't know, and I'm going to develop your descendants into a great nation. So that's the calling. So it's a calling, and it's also a covenant he's making with Abraham as well, isn't he? And so he's saying, I'm going to bless you, I'm going to expand you, I'm going to give you children, and those children are going to multiply and eventually become a whole country. And it'll be a great country. And so yes, there is a blessing, and the ultimate blessing that came through Abraham was not just his model of faith, which also certainly is something that the New Testament expands on quite a bit for us, especially Paul and Romans and such, but of course the Messiah came through the lineage of Abram. Okay, so this is I don't know, what do you call this? Deductive thinking, deductive interpretation. When you see here that God tells you not only to travel to a different land, but make sure that you leave your family, and he points out in your father's house, it tells us that even though Abraham's house was in pretty good order, it wasn't in the order that God knew was ideal. And so in other words, Abraham was kind of one of those within his family that his family was obviously compromised to a certain measure. And so because of that, God is saying, listen, you're different. You're an exception. You want to step out all the way for God. You want to follow him in all ways. And so we find that Abram's dad, Terah, his family was certainly above average, I'm sure, in knowledge and influence from the truth. After all, Terah was the direct great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild of Shem. Yeah, we've studied this in the past, I think last week as well. So Shem, okay, and Shem, it turns out, when we looked at those lineages, Shem's genealogy is the only one that was repeated both in chapter 10 and chapter 11, because Shem had the cleanest lineage as far as faithfulness to God, adhering to the truth. Ham was kind of like the Cain of Adam and Eve's day. And so you have two sets of parents, of course, that were all descendants of Adam and Eve. And then, of course, sadly, we had Cain, who went sideways at some. The other two parents, which is Noah and his wife. And so you have Ham, which is the least clean as far as faithfulness to God in his lineage. Japheth was pretty clean too. We have Magog in there and such, but it was pretty clean. But Shem had the most faithful lineage and such. So Terah was a descendant of Shem. And so obviously the lineage of Shem was the lineage that God had chosen to be able to bring eventually the Messiah, Jesus, to the world, who would also be a descendant of Terah, a descendant of Abram. Now, another thing that's interesting to keep in mind is even after Abraham received this call. So when Abraham actually received this call, Shem, who lived before, during, and after the flood, the actual son of Noah, still lived. And so we don't know, the Bible doesn't tell us how much crossover there was as far as their conversations and influence that Shem had on Abram. But certainly because Abram was so faithful, he probably did have maybe some exposure to Shem himself and had that opportunity, at least as a possibility. So because his family was influenced, and by the way, if they're compromised, the most common compromise back then would be idolatry, wouldn't it? And so we find that in the days not only here of Abram and those generations, but of course all through most of Israel's history, sadly, we see a lot of compromise. If you're going to compromise, you typically start to compromise in regards to other gods. Now it's a little bit different today because we just don't have that as a temptation. But back then, everybody served some god or a number of gods. And so if you start to compromise, well, you'd start to integrate some of the different gods and traditions and practices that existed back then. Okay, so Abraham's desire and commitment to follow God and God alone in all things was probably a little bit over the top for his family. And that is something that I just want to draw out a little bit here because I want us to understand that even great men like Abraham had his challenges. And when we step out for Christ and we want to follow God all the way, have you ever had your family say, listen, following God is important, even going to church, we go to church too, but you're a little extreme, or they'll use words like fanatical. It's one thing to follow God and go to church, but now you're getting fanatical. Now, we can become fanatical, can't we? When you look back in our history, we've had fanatical movements that take place where some members will take kind of an offshoot and they'll start to run with, the Holy Flesh movement we had in our history and some of these fanatical movements that really were wrong. And they certainly weren't in harmony with the Bible. So sometimes the devil will take us to the extremes. We'll get too carried away and we'll start to develop theology that is not even in the Bible, is not even in harmony with the Bible. And so that's possible. But the word fanatical quite often is used for people who just sincerely want to follow Christ all the way in all things. And so Abraham may have heard words like, listen, Abraham, it's good to follow God, but this is getting a little fanatical or a little bit extreme. At the end of chapter 11, it appears that Abraham hesitated a little bit to follow God's calling all the way. As we discussed last week a little bit, especially, and it really clarified it in the spirit of prophecy for me. It certainly did in the book of Patriarchs and Prophets. But in chapter 12, verse 1, we said, now the Lord had said to Abraham. And so, yes, it describes Abram and his dad and probably his mother, his nephew Lot, and his other brother Nahor and so on, and his wife and such, that all those families kind of moved over to Haran. And so they made it the bulk of the trip to the land of Canaan, but they didn't quite make it all the way. And so we And so we find here that Abraham is probably hesitating a little bit in his in responding to his call, because when he gets to Haran, his family follows him that far, but then they kind of get settled, they get comfortable, they're close to the promised land, but they're not in the promised land yet, are they? And it doesn't tell us how many years it is, but it must be years, because they kind of stop there, they camp, they settle down, and then finally his dad comes to the end of his life, and Terah dies. Well, Abraham buries his dad, and the Lord's calling is still there. He's still under conviction, and so it tells us that he packs up and he begins to make his way south to the promised land. Well, let's read in verse 2. I want to look at a couple of different things first. There's two key words there in the beginning of verse 2. It says, God says to Abraham, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great. Okay, so those are the two words I want to pick up, which is nation and name. How did God make Abraham into a great nation? How did God make Abraham into a great nation?
Lots of offspring.
Okay, lots of offspring. Okay. All right. Big family man. So they multiplied and multiplied until finally there was millions of them. And of course there was a powerful delivery out of slavery in Egypt. And God called his son out of Egypt and into the promised land of Canaan. And then he established him. And Israel was intended to be the light of the world. It was intended to be the source and ultimate resource for all mankind to be able to see and learn about the true God, the blessings and the benefits that come from following God and having faith in God. And so that was certainly important. What about a great name? What did God mean when he said, I'm going to make you a great nation and I will make your name great?
Everybody wanted to be from the line of Abraham.
Okay. So Walter's saying everybody wanted to be from the line of Abraham. Now you're talking about Jews, and like Paul's saying, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews, and
anybody and everybody wanted that.
Okay.
Blessed nation.
Okay. Any other suggestions? How else did God make Abraham's name great? Anybody heard of Abraham before our study tonight? All right. If you were to do a survey on a random street in Sacramento tomorrow and you asked 20 people, how many people do you think would have heard of Abraham? There's probably a good chance there'd be all 20. There might be one or two nowadays. Secularism is taking over more and more with our younger generations and such, and so people aren't quite as church. But even the unchurched kind of, there's a lot that have heard of Abraham. And so his name's great in the fact that he's famous, isn't he? So Abraham is certainly one of the most famous figures of all of human history. Not only is he famous, he's famous and at the heart of all three great religions in the world. We have Christianity, of course, but then we have Judaism, and we also have Islam. And so all three of the biggest religions in the world have Abraham as kind of the father of the faith. So certainly he's big as far as his fame and his being known and such.
Even one of our presidents had Abraham as a name.
Okay, so even one of our presidents, and I'm getting a history lesson on America. Yeah, Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so even one of our presidents here in this country was named after Abraham. What do you think God was speaking to in regards to making his name great? What do you think he had at the heart of it? Really trying to dig now and get you to think. Responsibility, yeah, that would be a big part of it, yes. Yeah.
I think his faith was a very significant thing.
Yes, thank you, yeah. And faith, when you have sincere faith that you stick with and then you hold on to, it develops character, doesn't it? Okay, and so this is kind of reflective of different studies that we've had in Revelation. The Revelation tells us that in the very last years of history, all our decisions will start to determine whether or not we have the mark of the beast or as it also says in Revelation chapter 13, the name of the beast on our forehead, or whether we'll have the name of God on our forehead. And so I think God is most likely, more than anything, when he says, I will make your name great, is he's saying it will be one of the greatest examples of faith that you can find in all the Bible. And so, yeah, I think that's probably at the heart of what he was saying when I'll make your name great. And you shall be a blessing because of it. So he'll be a blessing for a couple of reasons. Well, number one, because he's going to multiply, and he's going to bring his faith and his influence to his descendants and his descendants all the way through, many centuries to follow. And of course, he's also a blessing because he's a great model for us, isn't he? How many people have looked up to Abraham and studied this and said, Lord, help me to have the faith and life like Abraham did. And so that's important as well. Well, let's move on to verse number 3. In verse number 3, it says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. Well, that's an interesting statement, isn't it? When God made covenants with others, he didn't always say that. I'm not sure if he said it with any others that he made a covenant, but within this case, he said, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. Maybe it reminds us that we should be very careful in how we treat and respect and talk about the Lord's anointed. Different folks that God calls to leadership in the church. Of course, Paul was inspired to remind us of that as well, that we're to respect and remember our leaders and such. And so God is saying, listen, if we choose, and sometimes I've cringed at the way I've heard some people talk about, church leaders, pastors, and such. And sometimes if we start to curse with our words others that God has called, God might not be too happy about that. We might be calling a curse upon ourselves when we do that. And so I think this is a fitting reminder and a helpful reminder for us to remember how we speak about and how we treat and respect those who the Lord has called. All right, so we talked already about all the families of the earth being blessed, so let's move on to verses 4 and 5. In verses 4 and 5, it says, So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old, and he departed from Haran. And so there we have the confirmation. He packed up, he gathered together his one nephew, his family, and such. But is that all that he gathered together? Well, verse 5 starts to tell us that there was more than, sometimes when we read our storybooks, as far as Sabbath school pictures for toddlers and younger ages and such, we have a little family of, 12 or 15 people, going down the road. And when reality is that there were dozens and dozens in his camp that started to go down the road when they left Haran. Then Abraham took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. We'll come back to that. And they departed to go to the land of Canaan, and so they came to the land of Canaan. Now, the most intriguing part of this particular verse, in verse 5, is that they gathered all their possessions, and they also gathered the people whom they had acquired in Haran. Now, when I went to the book, Patriarchs and Prophets, it tells me in that book that many of those people that it's referring to, that the Lord is referring to here, are people that Abraham and his wife Sarah had won to the Lord. These were local native people that lived in the area of Haran, just north of Canaan, and so they were evangelizing, and they were sharing the gospel, and they were sharing, why do they have this altar? Why are they sacrificing on the altar? Where is it pointing to? Why is it pointing there and such? And so they would share the gospel with different people in Haran in that vicinity, and apparently there was more than one that they won to the Lord. And so they gave to the faith to the Lord, and when they did that, they said to Abraham, "Listen, this is a huge calling and covenant that God has made with you. We want to be a part of it. Can we come with you?" And so they volunteered themselves to be able to join the camp with Abraham, and so we have several that have been won to the Lord, as Abraham counts himself not only as a journeyer, not only as a pilgrim, I should say, but also as a missionary. Abraham understood that he was a missionary, and he was winning people to the Lord. So there was a number of people they acquired. Then we come to verse 6. In verse 6 it says, "So Abraham passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land." And so here's Abram. He comes to the northern border of Canaan. He enters in, and of course, as we talked about last week, he didn't know where he was going. He didn't know anything about the climate, how many people live there. He was kind of anticipating it to be some open real estate that God wanted him to stake out and kind of claim to himself and begin to multiply and have children and spread out. And when he got there, there was all these fortified cities. There was these large Canaanites. You know, a lot of them still had a lot of the original height of Adam and such. And of course, we learned that later, even 400 plus years later, when Moses and the Israelites came in, they sent the spies in and they said, "We're like ants compared to the Canaanites." And so these were probably even larger than the Canaanites were in Moses' day, as our stature kind of kept shrinking over the years. And so when Abraham came in, there was these large Canaanites everywhere, large fortified cities and armies and such. And so he thought, well, this is just the beginning. Maybe he meant a little bit more south in Canaan, and so he would go a little bit further south. Same thing, a little bit further south. Now he's in the middle of Canaan. Now he's in the heart of it, and he keeps going, and he gets to the end, almost to the end. And same thing, there's population everywhere, fortified cities everywhere. And so when Abraham gets close to the southern border, he's starting to think to himself, this is not what I envisioned at all. And so Abraham is discouraged. It's very discouraging. And that's why I believe in verse 6 it points out that the Canaanites were then in the land. He didn't expect it to be so populated and so many people that had already settled in ahead of him and ahead of his clan. And so what I like about the very next verse is that it reveals a very patient and compassionate God. Because here we have a God that is looking down at his servant Abraham. Abraham's the faithful, he's sincere, his heart's for the Lord all the way. And Abraham's kind of fighting discouragement now. He's, there's a bit of a cloud over his head, and he's really tempted to question, what's going on here. This is not the way I envisioned this calling and this covenant. And so verse 7, it says that the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. And so just when Abraham needed it again. Now, did God give him any new information? Not really, did he? So he didn't appear in another vision before Abraham to give him new information, but rather instead he appeared to Abraham because Abraham needed to hear it again. Now it's probably been, it's almost for certain been a few years since he received the first call that we read in the beginning of the chapter when he was way back in Ur. In the meantime, he and his greater family members and such had moved to Haran. They settled down there for a few years until his dad died, and now he's traveling, and now he's in the south. So it's been a few years since he received that calling. And so here we have a patient and compassionate God appears to him, not to give him new information, but to confirm his promise, to confirm his covenant that he had for him as well. And so that's important for us to pick up. There's a lesson for us here. And what's that lesson? Not everything that God calls us to do works out the way that we expect it. Have you ever had that experience? God calls you, inspires you to go a certain direction. He wants you, says, okay, I want you to do such and such. I want you to take a certain ministry in the church. I want you to go and do a mission trip somewhere in a certain place for a certain time. There's a number of different scenarios that we as modern Christians experience in the same way that Abraham did as far as a calling goes. God has put a passion or opened a door for us to accept a missionary posting somewhere. And more times than not, it doesn't work out the way that we had anticipated it. You know, we kind of envisioned it a certain way, and maybe even that's the way that was planned. Maybe the conference and the mission post had told you it's going to be this way, but then when you get there, things turn out totally different. And sometimes you can be discouraged and say, well, maybe the Lord hasn't called me here. Maybe this isn't the Lord's calling. Maybe this isn't the way that God had meant for it to work out. And this is confirming for us that even Abraham had that experience. Even Abraham stopped and thought, wait a minute, this is not the way I saw it. This is not the way I understood it was going to work out. And but we still continue on, don't we? We still continue on. We understand that, hey, even though it doesn't work out the way that we envisioned it, we want to trust God step by step. And I've had that more than once in my ministry. I thought I was going to a certain place, and I tried all I could do to get into a certain direction with my ministry, and it didn't work out. And then I realized, as the years go by, that even though I was discouraged and frustrated at times, the Lord had different plans. And his plans are always better than what I envisioned. Amen? And so the same thing should be for us. And so this is what we're reading about when we look at these first verses on Abraham. Well, what was Abraham's response to the vision now, this experience and exposure to God that he has? He goes ahead and he builds an altar, doesn't he? Okay, so of course when he builds an altar, I always think we just have to think back 2 or 3 or 4 chapters, and we're at Noah's time, and as soon as Noah got off the boat, what did he do? He built an altar, didn't he? And so it's the same thing here as well. And so first we find that God reconfirms his loyalty to the covenant. Abraham's in discouraging circumstances. It's not working out the way he thought, and so God appears in his compassion and his patience, and he says, Abraham, listen, I'm still with you. I know it's not the way that you thought it was going to be, but I'm still with you. And so God reconfirms his loyalty to the covenant. Abraham responds with sacrifice and worship to reconfirm his loyalty to following God. And that's why Abraham continued to follow the pathway that God had for him, and he continues to be a faithful follower throughout the chapters that follow. Why an altar? Let's read verse 8. In verse 8 it says, and he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. And so he moves from the place where he first received the vision at the tree, at the terebinth tree at Morah, and he moves over between Ai and Bethel. He's on a mountain, a small, of course, when we say mountain in Israel, when you've been to Israel and you see a mountain, what they call a mountain, we kind of call a hill. But nevertheless, he's up on a higher place on this mountain, and he builds another altar. Now, why does he build an altar? What does he do with an altar?
Makes an offering to the Lord.
Okay, makes what kind of offering?
Some kind of animal offering.
Okay, an animal offering, right. Okay, so he sacrifices an animal, and he puts it on the altar. Why does he sacrifice an animal? Okay, to point to the coming of Jesus. All right, so it was a lamb, a ram, some kind of clean animal, a number of different clean animals that God had directed his people right from the beginning to sacrifice, right from Adam and Eve and their family all the way through. And all of it was symbolically and very deeply pointing to the greatest news and hope that each generation had, which was the fact that one day that which it was symbolizing, that which it was a type of, would be fulfilled in the Son of God himself. That one day the Son of God, the eternal Holy One, would find himself taking on holy flesh, living a earthly life, and dying a perfect sacrifice for our sins and for our guilt. That we might have a substitute, that we might have somebody that's going to atone for our sins, that we might have hope of eternal life, that we might have hope of leaving the doomed family of Adam and entering into the eternal victorious family of Jesus Christ. And so Abraham understood that. And so he continues to bring these altars, or make these altars, as he went to different places in his journey, and he would remind himself, he would claim the same faith that Abel did, and all the faithful like Noah and others beforehand. Now, one of the things that, again, my favorite book on this particular subject is in Patriarchs and Prophets, and that is that as Abraham moved, he did the same thing as he did in Haran. he didn't just keep the gospel to himself. He kept sharing it with not with the local Haranites, but he was sharing it with the local Canaanites now. And so wherever he went, he would start to share as he got different opportunities with the locals. And he would share the gospel. And they would probably come up to him and say, hey, what are you doing down here? Why are you sacrificing on this simple little kind of more primitive altar that he would make? Why don't you go and, we've got these super altars. They're under the groves up on the high hills. And we have these amazing gods that we bring them to. And we don't just bring little lambs. Why, even sometimes we bring children. We bring humans and put them on the altar, so we even sacrifice and give more than you do. Why do you just have a lamb on a simple altar? And Abraham would be able to explain and say, well, my understanding is just a little bit different yours, in the fact that God has not called us to try to impress him with how much we give, but rather he has called us to impress him with our heart and surrendering to him. And he would talk about the Messiah, and he would talk about the hope of having our guilt taken away by the Messiah. And he would share the gospel with them. He'd share the great plan of salvation and clarify that all these other sacrifices and ceremonies and altars and so on that are being used by the local Canaanites were all counterfeits. That those were all deceptions, and really there's only one way. And that's Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes unto the Father except through him. And so as he would share that, why some of them would, of course, take those seeds and they would start to germinate over the years. And some of them probably gave their faith and their heart to the God of Abraham. And so it is said that when these Canaanites later on, years even after Abraham was gone, they would come to these altars that still remained, and they would say, oh, there's one of Abraham's altars. And it would bring back to mind again the gospel message that they had heard through Abraham. And so some of them, I'm guessing, even reused those altars. Some of the ones that gave their heart to the Lord and to the God of Abraham. And Abraham's long gone, but they're bringing an altar and they say, hey, there's Abraham's altar. Let's clean it up and let's use it. And they would sacrifice an animal in there by faith, worshiping the same God that God had revealed to this man of old. Okay, well, we still have time to go ahead. So let's look at verse 10. It says, now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. So things have gone from bad to worse. As far as, first he was discouraged and disappointed by what he found in Canaan. It's going to be way more challenging than he expected. He expected to have some nice, again, open real estate. And now the famine comes along, and he's forced to go south into Egypt. I think we've skipped verse 9, didn't we? So Abram journeyed going still toward the south. The famine comes along. He needs to even go so far south that he leaves the land of Canaan, the promised land, and he goes into another foreign country, the country of Egypt. And it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarah his wife, indeed I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. So here we go. We're entering into an experience that reveals that Abraham is still in process. And even though his name became great and is even famous today, and we're looking for inspiration from him, it's revealing that he has some room to grow still. Because it says in verse 12, therefore it will happen, as he talks to his wife, when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, this is my wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. And so Abraham's concerned for his life. It's sometimes easy to be critical on Abraham here, but how many of us have been guilty of kind of compromising being 100% honest for something much less than our life? They give us the wrong change at the store. We get out to the car and we think, should I have walked away with that, or should I have, been honest with the clerk right up front? And then we still wrestle. Should I go back in there and talk to and so on. So we can compromise sometimes for things that are much less even than Abraham was compromising here, but not to excuse it, but certainly we can relate to some measure or another. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you, and of course they're going to kill me, they will let you live. And then verse 13 says, please say you are my sister. Now, was Sarai his sister? Okay, so technically, some people are saying, yeah, he was a sister. As it turns out, I think, was it the same mother or the same father that he shared? I forget now. I think he shared the same mother, but not the same father. And so here we have Abraham, and so he's saying, listen, the fact of the matter is, you are my half-sister. And so, was it legitimate to say, this is my sister? Was she a sister? Yeah, if you want to make things simple. But where did he compromise? Where was the mistake made? Where did he fail in regards to the ninth commandment, thou shalt not covet? Thou shalt not bear false witness. Okay, so he had called her his sister in order to hide the truth that he was his wife. And so, of course, that's where he compromised, didn't he? So he says, please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. And he said, listen, if you really love me, if you're really going to care for me, you're going to do this for me, right? And of course, Sarah doesn't want to lose her husband, so we don't know how much she had to say. I'm not sure if she had much to say. It doesn't record. And so it was when Abraham came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. And so, sure enough, just as Abraham had suspected, the men began to eye out his wife. He'd experienced this before. When you have a beautiful wife, you're going to have more men looking on them. In verse 15, it says, the princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. And so the word got back to the princes, and eventually to the ultimate king, Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh goes and says, well, if she's that pretty, if she's that good looking, you better make sure that she comes over to my house. And verse 16, he treated Abram well for her sake. He said, well, if that's her brother, we better treat him well. He's in the family. He's going to be a brother-in-law soon enough. Right? Yes?
Pastor Shawn, it's also interesting to note that Sarah is over 6 years of age at this time.
Right.
So she must have been really good looking.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because he was 75 and she was about 60. Yeah. So you probably, yeah. Because they still lived 100 and something years, yeah. And even today, you can find some pretty good-looking 60-year-olds, Pardon me? Pastor Doug said, yeah, I'm one. Okay. Well, I'm not going to argue with it. Okay. All right. Now you got me so flustered I can't. Where were we? Verse 11. No. Verse 16 we're at. So he treated Abram well, right? He's going to be a future brother-in-law. Well, for her sake, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. And so Abraham is pretty prosperous by this point, isn't he? Okay, that was one of the biggest measuring of prosperity and wealth back then, was how many animals and such that you owned. And then verse 17 it says, but the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And so here we have the Lord is needing to intercede. And so now we have the compassion and the grace of the Lord looking down. Now, you know, if God wasn't the God that he is, he would have naturally looked down and just said, you shyster, you blew it. Here where I thought we had something good going here. I was relying on you. I'm going to make your name great. And now you're going and making a bad name for me and for yourself. And every time I read this, I cringe and I feel I don't know if I should say feel sorry for Abram, because he's learning a lesson that we all need to learn if we're in the same situation. But let's read on. It says, and Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. Now, I don't know about you, but I find one of the most embarrassing experiences that I ever have as a believer is when a non-believer is rebuking me for my immorality. You know, it's one thing when a fellow believer comes up and says, hey, Shawn, you know, I'm a little bit concerned about you in this area of your life. You're kind of going sideways a little bit here. And that's, you know, humbling enough. But to have an unbeliever come up to you, a pagan come up to you and say, hey, listen, you know, what in the world were you thinking? Why did you lie to me? Why weren't you upfront with me? Why weren't you honest with me? And so can you see Abraham blushing? Every time I read this, you know, I picture Abraham's skin kind of going a little red, because now he's got this pagan king that is rightfully rebuking him for his immorality. And it also reveals that God is pretty gracious at times, isn't he? Because God here is intervening and he's getting him out of a hard spot, because it's a really difficult spot now. I mean, the Pharaoh is no small figure. I mean, this is one of the most powerful figures in the world, you know, and so he could easily have just, you know, gave the command and Abraham would have lost his head before sundown that day. You know, but God intervenes and he brings these plagues. And so God knows what he's dealing with. He only uses power in this way, I believe, as much as he needs to when it's needed. And so God is not showing off here, and he's not saying, oh, good, now I can make the, you know, the king of Egypt have a hard time, you know, that shyster, I can give him some plagues. No, he knows what he's dealing with, and he knows what is required to get Abraham out of this hard spot that he had got himself into. Did Abraham deserve to be where he was?
Yep.
He did, didn't he? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So sometimes we deserve to be in situations that we're in as well, but thank God that there is some graciousness that God extends to us to be able to help us learn from our mistakes. Yes?
Do you think God softened Pharaoh's heart?
Pardon me?
Do you think God softened?
Soften Pharaoh's heart? I don't know. I don't know if Pharaoh's heart needed to be softened. When I read the rebuke that the Pharaoh's kind of revealing here, I think that Abraham had underestimated or overestimated, I'm not sure how you would say it, the mind and the morality of Pharaoh. I think that he figured, hey, you know, we're going into a land of pagans and superstition and so on, and so surely they'll do the worst to us. You know, they'll see that you're beautiful. They'll see that I'm married to you. And so the only solution that he could find is to take my head off and take you, Sarah, as in his harem. But from what I read in the response of Pharaoh, it seems to me that Pharaoh's saying, hey, if you would have been upfront with me and honest with me from the beginning, we wouldn't be in this mess and I would have just left you guys alone. You know? Yeah. Yeah? Yeah. That's true. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Never thought of that. Thank you. And then finally in verse 20 it says, so Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. And so tomorrow, or not tomorrow, but next week we'll pick it up with Abram leaving Egypt. And of course there's some deep symbolism there in regards to Jesus going down into Egypt and coming up as well. But I don't want to get too far ahead. I'm just excited about that.